After talking about all the different types of angle relationships in the last video, let's now look at a couple problems that will be very similar to the ones that you'll see on tests and quizzes. In our first example, you can see we're given this diagram off to the left, and we're asked three questions. Let's concentrate on A first. Determine the value of x. To determine the value of x, we need to set up an equation. But remember, in math we can never assume, so we have to pull something that is true in this diagram. Well, let's concentrate on these two angles. We have two intersecting lines, and the expression 3x plus 14 is referring to this angle in red, and the expression 5x minus 6 is referring to this angle in blue. What type of relationship do these two angles have? Well, they are being intersected and created by two intersecting lines, and they are angles directly across from each other. Well, that is the definition of vertical angles. But to write our equation, we have to remember the key characteristic for all vertical angles. All vertical angles are congruent, meaning they are equal in measure. Well, if they are equal in measure, we can give both of these angles the same tick mark. And that allows us to write our first equation to solve for x. As you can see, our equation is 3x plus 14 equals 5x minus 6 because both of these angles are vertical angles and all vertical angles are congruent. Now let's use our algebra skills and work backwards to solve for x. After using our algebra skills, we find out that x equals 10. Let's concentrate on B now. It says determine the value of y. But there is no other vertical angle expression for me to set for y equal to this other angle because these two angles are vertical angles. Well, we got to dig a little deeper. What else do we know? I just solved for x, and both of these expressions has an x in it. So why don't we plug in this value of x, 10, into both of these expressions to find out what this angle measure is. As you can see, after I plugged in x into the 5x minus 6 expression, I find out that this blue angle is 44 degrees. To save time, remember, we know that this angle and this angle are congruent, so if this is 44 degrees, I know that this is also 44 degrees. Let's label that diagram. The question is how is this information going to help me solve for y? I want you guys to look carefully now. Let's look at this red angle right over here. We know that that angle is one of two angles. The other angle is the 4y angle. Let me label that in black. This angle right here. We know that this angle, 44 degrees, and the 4y angle are lying on the same line. Remember, all lines have a degree measure of 180 degrees. So how could I use that information to help me solve for y? Well, if this angle and the 4y angle are on a line, well, they make an angle that is 180 degrees. Well, that was another one of our relationships. This angle in red and this angle in black are supplementary. Two angles that add up to 180 degrees. With that information, we're able to write our next equation. As you can see, our equation is 44 plus 4y equals 180 because both of these angles are supplementary. Now let's use our algebra skills and solve for the missing variable. After working backwards, we find out that y equals 34. Perfect. Now let's concentrate on this last question. C. Determine all missing angle measures. Remember, I've already found out 2 out of the 4 angle measures. I just need to now find these 2 angle measures. Well, if I solve for y already, I can now plug in y into this expression to find out the angle measure of that one. Let's do that. When I plugged in 34 for y in this expression, I get 4 times 34, which gives me 136 degrees. So this black angle is 136 degrees. But remember, this angle and this angle are vertical angles. So if this angle is 36, I don't need to do any math. I already know that this angle also is 136 degrees. And I think that wraps up this problem. In our second example, you can see that we have this diagram that we'll be using to answer all of these questions. The first question is, angle DOB and what other angle are vertical angles? Remember, vertical angles are angles that are created by 2 intersecting lines and are directly across from each other. Well, you can see that line DO and line BA are the 2 lines that create that DOB angle. Well, what other angle is directly across from it using those same 2 lines? Well, I see that the other vertical angle would be this angle in black. Let's name this correctly. Well, if we start at A, go to O, and go to C, we can say this is angle AOC. B, angle A, I'll do this in red. Angle AOD. And what are vertical angles? Again, identify the 2 intersecting lines, AO and DO. What other angle is directly across from it and is created by those same 2 lines? Well, as you can see, I'll continue doing this in red. The other angle that uses both of those lines and is directly across from it is angle COB. So therefore, angle AOD and angle COB are vertical angles. C. Identify a pair of complementary angles. Remember, complementary means angles that add to 90 degrees. Well, we do have our 90-degree tick mark right here, but remember, a pair of complementary angles means 2. This is simply just one angle. What we have to do is dig a little deeper. If this angle is 90 degrees, we also can conclude that this angle in blue is 90 degrees as well, because remember, a straight line has a measure of 180 degrees, and 90 plus 90 is 180 degrees. So what 2 angles add to 90 degrees? As we can see, I'll do this in blue, we have angle EOD, angle wrong spot. We have angle EOD and angle DOB. Angle DOB. These are our 2 complementary angles. Part D. Identify a pair of supplementary angles. Remember, supplementary angles are angles that add to 180 180 degrees. We were just talking about all lines have an angle measure of 180 degrees. Well, let's pick two angles that are on this line because those would make those supplementary. I'll pick one and I'll label that in black. I say we use angle AOD. This angle right here. Angle AOD. Well, what is the other angle that completes the 180 degrees? That would be DOB. And angle DOB. These are two supplementary angles. Now on E, we're going to have to do a little bit of work. It says determine the value of x. We know that to determine the value of x, we have to come up with an equation. The great thing is we've already identified the information that we need to write the equation. Remember, in part C, we said both of these angles are complementary, meaning they add to 90 degrees. So if this angle and this angle are complementary, we know that this plus this equals 90 degrees, and that's our equation. Now we can use our algebra skills and solve for the missing variable. After combining like terms and using inverse operations, we find out that x equals 25. Part F. Determine the value of y. How are we going to determine the value of y? Well, we know that we've solved for x already, and we found out in part A that angle AOC and angle DOB are vertical angles, meaning they are congruent, meaning they have the same angle measure. Let's give those tick marks. We'll give them the Adidas. Well, if we know these two angles are vertical angles, meaning they are congruent, meaning they have the same angle measure, I've already solved for x, so let's plug in 25 into this expression and find out what this angle measure is. After plugging in 25 into our expression of 3 times x minus 15, we find out that this angle measure is 60 degrees. Well, if this angle is 60 degrees and it is congruent to angle AOC, where angle y lies, I know that this angle and this angle are the same measure. Therefore, y equals 60. Lastly, G says determine all missing angle measures and label the diagram. Okay, well, we know that angle y, this angle right here is 60 degrees. We know that this tick mark indicates that that angle is 90 degrees. Right now, we have this angle right here that represents x plus 5. But remember, we've already solved for x. So let's plug in 25 into x and add 5, which I think we all should know that that would give us 30 degrees. We've also need to find this missing angle and this missing angle. This angle is represented by an expression with the variable of x. We did the work already. Let's plug in 25 into x and solve. As you can see, we get 4 times 25 plus 3 gives me 100 plus 3 gives me 103 degrees. So right now, we have found all of these angles except for one. What information can we use to solve for that one missing angle? If we concentrate on this one line, AB, and we still remember that all lines have an angle measure of 180 degrees, I have the 60-degree angle plus the 103 angle plus this missing angle will all equal 180. Well, I think that helps to solve for this one angle. The equation would be 60 plus 103 plus, I'm going to give it z, a variable that we haven't used, equals 180 degrees. Now we can combine like terms. I get 163 plus z equals 180. Get rid of the 163. What you do to one side, you have to do to the other. And then I get z equals 17 degrees. I hope this example clarifies all of our angle relationships, and I will see you guys in class tomorrow.